We want to continue where Mr. Lucas, the ambassador, stopped. Defending security, defending Europe. We are talking about this world we can live in, and this, of course, includes the safety, the freedoms which we have. I've got a wonderful panel here next to me, and I believe across disciplines is wonderfully here. Christine Langefeld, she's professor for public right at the Göttingen University, and at the same time she is a judge at the Constitutional Court Second Senate. Very happy to have you here. Claudia Wiesner, to my left, she's a professor in Fulda, and she's also a political scientist. And on the other side, there is a local star on the economical sky. And here you see the director of the IFA Institute in Vienna, an economist. Mrs. Langfeld, I would like to ask you the first question. Now, talking about Europe, Jean-René Sartre, Europe is being done in times of crisis. We just heard it. Mr. Lucas mentioned it. The world is in a crisis, and in particular, peace in Europe is broken. It's not only threatened, it's broken. But nevertheless, I can see hardly anything has happened so far on a European level when we talk about defending ourselves. On the 30th of August, which means in a few weeks' time, it will be 70 years that the French National Assembly created the project of European Defence Association failed. Now, if you think about it, how can we reach that also from a, say, constitutional point of view? What do you think? What should Europe's answer be to these crises? Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate in this panel and talk to you. I know that these are difficult times, but nevertheless, I'd like to say that I'm very, very much convinced that the European Union and strengthening it will be key to the fact that Europe and the states united in it can make a contribution to peace and will be able to secure its own values and prosperity. In this case, I believe we should look at two things. One, and Mr. Schularik mentioned it, it's strengthening the defense union, working out joint defense and security policy. We just heard a proposal that under certain conditions, we need a qualified majority when it comes to taking decisions, and according to the contract, this is possible according to the respective contracts. This is something people should work on, and of course this should also be, say, the aspiration of the German federal government. And I think they should support it if everything's being done within the contractual possibilities. Now, amending contracts, going beyond that, and, leading to a supranationalization of the defense, security, and, foreign policies, I believe that's outside the possibilities which are available to us at present. But, I think more integration is possible within the framework of the respective contracts. And the member states, I believe, have to become very, very clear that if you do not join together, pull together, particularly against the threat posed by Russia, our situation will become very serious. Now, if Ukraine really loses the war, then Putin will certainly stay hungry, attack other countries. I just went to Lithuania, and I can say I experienced it, feel it, sensed it, the anxieties, the concerns existing in that society. We also have to be aware that there will be more and more refugees coming to us, and there are scientists saying that up to 10 million refugees will come to the European Union, in particular to Germany, from Ukraine, and also to Austria. Now, this would be a destabilizing factor. And then another point which we can address later, it is about strengthening the European Union as an economic power. We have to, say, expand the domestic market, strengthen it, and the European Union certainly has to become, say, more committed to the free trade agreements. I can say that the situation there has come to a standstill. CETA, other free trade, Mercosur, and others. You see, there are diverse and multifaceted difficulties, and has to do with some of the member states. But nevertheless, I believe that the European Union has to go all out for interconnect better, network better, as they say, and share values. And I believe at the end of the day, this would be an instrument which will help us to defend what we consider to be essential to our lives. Thank you very much. Gabriel, I'd like to ask you, earlier than many of us like to see, on the 6th of November, or shortly after that, you see, having received the results of the US elections, we might face a situation that we, as Europeans, have to think about the fact whether or not we want to continue the support if the United States is no longer doing that. Now, Austria didn't really, say, own up to say, supporting Ukraine. And if you look at the situation now, how do you see that? Can we afford all this? Can we continue supporting it? I should say that this is really a delicate situation. Austria is neutral since 1955. And this saved us from, a split country because, the occupational forces left in 1955. And this is certainly something which is part and parcel of the situation, of the understanding the Austrians have about themselves. Therefore, it's a bit difficult to talk about, say, military support. But when accessing the European Union, we also had to comply with the respective regulations in the European contracts. Tanks, cannons is not enough in this respect, but we also can give other types of support, like, for instance, measures related to, say, the population, or related to say, rescue services. And if things were to happen, then I think people would, own up and do something. Maybe more so than in Germany, maybe we've got an increased discussion going on in this country. I can say that here there is a strong political grouping which really questions whether or not we should support Ukraine. If costs were higher, then there would be really a very intense discussion going on here. Here in Austria, I believe we have to commit ourselves to the European model. What my colleague said is something I'd like to agree to underpin. And by the way, we have got a paradoxical situation that there are countries just attacking other countries. So you have to think about things. We have to see that Europe and its security policies, that just imagine that someone would attack us, as has happened in the past, and then would we get the support? So we have to think along these lines. 30 billion is the support coming from the United States. Now the United States might discontinue this support. 30 billion for the European Union. Do you think that's feasible? Well, it's ridiculously little. Over the last few days, coronavirus pandemic, 8 billion euros. This is ridiculous, thinking of the 30 billion. Well, of course, we need this amount every year. And certainly, maybe not a big issue, but nevertheless, what surprises me in these discussions, the European unions, if you look at it in total, and the budgets which we have, the military budgets which we have, then I should say we have got the second largest sum. Well, the Americans spent more, but then Europe. And of course, you know, and this is a scandal for an economist, meaning we have so much money but don't get anything for it. But, this is the situation, and I believe that this is the problem. You know, the budgets, we really have got a large budget and, hundreds of billions. So we can say that if we can't get this money, then we should really make sure that we could really get something for our money. That's very important. So winning, gaining in efficiencies, the ability to defend ourselves, economies of scale or things like this, this is also something which, supports the idea of Europe. Well, actually, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? Well, Claudia, please, you are a political scientist. Now, what do you think? What's your opinion on the European defense? And of course, we're going to have a closer look at the world at large. But nevertheless, what do you think? How Europe responds, and what do you think? Where are we heading? Well, wherever we go, we always do it with a lot of difficulties, I must say right now. I listened very carefully. Argument, majority decisions on the council in the terms of security policy. I don't really see it coming. Things have been kicked off, yes, and just take into account the European Union and its difficulties. You see, there are so many different interests also counteracting each other, also in relation to the Ukraine. Then there are players who say yes, support. Then there's Viktor Orban or Georgia Meloni. So there are some imponderabilities there, which we have to take into account on the council, that is. So a majority decision certainly would make things easier, but I'm not sure that the heads of state and government will be able to agree on one approach, because some of the players, like Viktor Orban, do not want to, say, follow suit. It's about power. Sanctions against Russia. He used that in order to force or blackmail the rest of the countries to agree to this or that. So it is not that easy. Yeah, if you look at the entire situation, I can say it is not easy, and it certainly doesn't help to make the European Union being able to act. I think about it every day, but you see, 27 states, different interests, and you have to bring them together somehow. Now, it's frustrating when looking at things from the outside. I understand that definitely, but nevertheless, I want to say, majority decisions in order to introduce a common security policy, that would be a good thing if it happened. And like was said before, costs of defense and economies of scale, all that. You see, I tend to be someone who is really not really thrilled by conductive wars, but nevertheless there are economical and other aspects which have to be taken into account. We've got a Spanish, Italian, Austrian, or other defense systems if we can't do things on a European level. I think we cannot avoid this issue. Defense on a European level, I think we can expand it. We will not be able to evade this issue. Whether I'm happy about this, well, that's a different kettle of fish. That's a different story. But nevertheless, I believe these are the most important aspects we should take into account. I think it would be very good, and it would be certainly good if we'd come up with this result. Now, could you explain to us, how can we go about it? Do you think it will be possible to, have the competencies up until, handing over the responsibility for taking decisions, and what can we do? Well, I would like to help you, but I'm a judge at the Constitutional Court, and the certain contractual amendments which will be necessary in order to do that. I'm not the one having, say, the responsibility to take decisions. And of course, according to our system, someone might file a constitutional complaint. And my experience I've gained, in the context of such amendments and other contractual relationships, also in the context of further development of the European Union, I'm sure someone will file a complaint. So I can only give you a very general answer. Surely there are possibilities in the contracts, that you can reach qualified decisions under certain conditions in certain areas. This is something which you will find in the contracts. But of course it means that certain decisions have to be taken by the European Council beforehand, which must be unanimous. So if you want to continue integrating Europe, take further integration steps, including a joint European army, then this is not, say, clearly stated in the contract. So we have to maybe amend things. So ability to defend ourselves. Well, you always have to take into account things like the national identities. Now, if we continue along lines, if it will be possible, I'm meaning people finally realize, really understand that we have to make progress and at least have to, say, create this partial possibility of having a joint army, or go to war, so to speak, together. I don't know whether we will stick to what is available right now, but nevertheless, if the situation occurs, then we certainly have to take a decision. Okay, back from the general aspects now to the specific aspect. Civic facem para bellum. So if you want peace, then prepare for war. I think you alluded to that before, because I think there is some kind of logic in there. Logic which can be found in discussions in other countries. And here things seem to be a bit clearer than here compared to, I mean, in Germany. So what's your response? What do you think? Well, difficult. So here we have the Federal Republic of Germany. And, we have traditions which is against war, for peace. We have respective clauses in our basic law. We can only defend ourselves, but not attack. So I should say that this is a slogan. I think it is very difficult to say sell this kind of slogan, but there's another argument. War, armament, extremely expensive, and take into account all the instruction which will happen afterwards. So talking about the European integration, I must say, you see, if we just leave it, then we would all be better off, invest this money for something else, and we will be able to build up and develop cities further, be it Paris or Cologne or some other city. Now this approach has worked for quite some time, but I believe we have another point which makes me very skeptical. You see, we set up certain aspects which are very successful, and I think when it comes to, say, military aspect, the European Union has to change its position. And we just heard this wonderful presentation, how difficult all this is. You have to change your mindset. And there might be a third argument, which I believe is very important. We had lots and lots of discussions. We discussed how we can handle climate change. What can we do, against it? And what I was happy to hear was that this will be possible only by using democratic principles, rule of law. Not so easy. Climate change is a complex matter, isn't it? So democratic processes, these are long-winded processes. Defense and war. I should say this is something at loggerheads, so to speak, even, has to be seen in contrast to what is written in our democratic, say, basic law. So having said that, I think that this will bring about certain tensions here or there. On the one hand, we want to defend ourselves, but on the other hand, there are obstacles to that. So I've got analytical capabilities enough to say, or rather, I would never say we should not invest in armaments or military. We have to. And I think there will be, say, a crisis here or there, all in the context of Russia. And this is a crisis which will be going on for the next 10 to 15 years. We cannot say that there isn't such a situation. But, I'm really against, this slogan, because I believe there are certain points which mean that we have to question things which have been working out very well for a long time. Germany built sidings not here in the famous tabloid in Germany. We've got 52 billion for defense spending earmarked for that. This amount hasn't grown during the last budget discussions. This means 1.2% of our gross domestic product, and then we've got children's allowances and all that for the military personnel, etc., calculating things backwards and forwards. When military was banned for Germany, we still spend some money on the military. So we are not very far away from the stipulations in the Versailles contract. 2%. This is what is demanded after 2 decades of underfinancing is certainly not enough. 3.5. America is on 3.5. Poland 4%. Now, if we enter these dimensions, means 50 to 100 billions to the 52 billion, then how can we finance all this? Well, I believe Karlsruhe has to show us a way forward, how we can bring things together, because I'm sure also indebtedness. Maybe save things here or there, and things which you cannot pay out of your petty cash. Well, so we have to find some consensus. Maybe reducing social benefits or whatever. We have to balance things. But there's one thing which is more dramatic. These are the non-existing capacities of a federal army, and to equip it. The worry is that you put the money on the table. Yes, that's great, absolutely great for the defense industry in Germany or in the United States, because they are going to sell their weapons at double the price, and without winning anything so far. So we have to talk about debts. Is that what we should do? Well, what do you mean should do? If there's no other way, then this would be the way out of this, say, dilemma. But unfortunately, there is the not unrealistic idea that with this debt cap and lower percentages, 1 or 1.5 of the gross domestic product, everything will be all right, and you can put tanks near the border to Russia. It's not necessarily something I'd like to see, but nevertheless, I think this debt cap, you can agree on that, or debt-financed expansion of the military budget, special funds, things like this. All this earmarked for the federal army. Well, that's one approach, yes, but it does not necessarily mean that we will be able to solve everything. We just want to make sure that we will have, say, military capacity building up. So where should the soldiers come from, for instance? And what about the readiness, to introduce conscription, compulsory conscription again? Now, having a number of soldiers which is sufficient. How can we do that? What about the armaments, the arms? Where should they come from? Where can they be produced? In which factories? Which machinery and plant to be used? And which engineers who are in a position to build all this? So maybe it's even more urgent to think about these things. But I'm convinced, like during the coronavirus pandemic, you see, you will come up with a solution, or you will be forced to work out a solution. But nevertheless, after we have done everything, and then there are the hundreds of billions on the table, and everyone is aghast about the result, then might be surprised that it is possible to buy security now. That's something not so easy. All right. Talking about this resolution with a view to climate protection and the subsistence levels or minimum subsistence level, then this is certainly something which is kind of the responsibility of the Constitutional Court, i.e. The politicians sometimes, hide things. I cannot give you a specific statement in this respect, i.e. meaning no debt cap and for not using the debt cap for some time, whether or not it's possible. I can say we presented the respective aspects in great detail, and under these conditions and in this situation, you have to subsume things. I believe that the federal, say, parliament, the Bundestag, is in a position to do so, come up with a good solution. Now, let me say, if you have a debt cap in your constitution, will you see have say the courts come into play. We made things clear. We defined things. We also made clear that it is possible to say put the debt cap on the back burner. So I believe this is clear also for legislation. Now, if things doesn't happen, then of course we must amend or change our basic law, and that must be a transparent process. We need two-thirds majority in the Bundestag, in the Bundesrat, and of course this also requires a political discussion or other things like the special, assets or special properties. All this has been anchored, but nevertheless, I do not want to tell you or show you what to do. The respective conditions are clear in the basic law, all in the context with our judgments which we passed. Climate policy, climate and security policy and its connections. Over the last few days, we heard that climate policy is also a kind of insurance against other things. Might be seen in the context of the defense policy. You pay a certain insurance premium, and this is to protect against yourself against any dangers tomorrow. And the higher the risk, the more you're willing to pay in terms of a premium. So please help us to understand how climate and security are interrelated. To what extent will it be possible to do something so that we will not end up somewhere? Well, you see, climate and security policy. I think it is obvious, isn't it? Just recall the climate sheet presentation, and that was about 2 hours ago. The temperatures today, and then the CO2 emissions, etc., etc. I had a very close look at this chart, and you see lots of world regions where climate change will have an enormous impact. So I'm certainly not an expert for climate policy, but nevertheless, I know, and this is what we heard, that it will be very difficult to survive if temperatures go up 40 or even higher, 45 degrees, and this is what it is all about. We want to survive. Okay, there will be conflicts. There will be conflicts about resources. What are people doing who cannot find food for themselves, and they try to find food somewhere else? So there is a potential for conflicts. Then this migration potential, and I should say there will be huge movements, and climate change, all this will cause enormous costs. So in economic terms, we have, or put it like this, we've got economical risks, and we have other risks. The risk of conflicts flaring up, and this means instability. We've got enormous risks with a view to instability, and instability always means more conflicts. So if I can, if I start thinking about instabilities, then I start, implementing security policies. So if you want to kind of hedge these risks or conflicts, if we handle climate change, then the world will be safer. We will have fewer people, facing or threatened by death, so to speak, or food crisis. But, we always have to use a kind of world perspective. And I want to warn people, you cannot say 10 million people, 2 billion people, or something like this in front of our doors. It will not be so easy. Not everyone will be in front of our doors. on our threshold. It is expensive and takes a lot of things to cross the Mediterranean, for instance. There will be refugees flows. There will be crises or conflicts which we never can think of right now. So, and we touched on some of these aspects to some extent. But nevertheless, we're going to see ecological change. This will also make, the rate of disease happening even more likely. At the end of the day, I believe whatever you invest in terms of money, in terms of thinking, might help. Okay, climate policy is one way of reducing conflicts, maybe not necessarily influencing this. We also have a trade policy, economical instruments which you might use in order to guarantee our interest in the world, pursue our interest in the world. And you did some research in this respect. What should we think? How should we think? Thinking of alternatives in order to be safe.
Well, you're talking about economic sanctions, for instance. Well, bread and beans instead of weapons, so we can institute sanctions. This is something that is easier for us to do because we have trade policy and we have a qualified majority. And this is also the competence of the European Union. And we still have the situation whereby the EU is a major power when it comes to trade. If you take the products and services together, we have power. And this power base is something that we can make use of. You can threaten and say, if you attack Ukraine, we will give you sanctions. But another thing is that it doesn't really, you can make a threat, and if somebody's willing to break the rules, we'll say, okay, it'll make things more expensive for me, but I'm going to go ahead anyway. And these are sanctions. It can just change the incentives. Now, this is questionable. Theory tells us that we've got about 1,500 sanctioned cases since 1950 in our database. About 40% of them, where we could say 40% of them are terminated cases, and 40% were ended with success. It took 25 years. So yes, we do have a tool, and it's directly proportional to the attractiveness of our single market. This is very important, our own defense. And we see that our market is becoming better for military as for everything else. And here we can say, okay, if you break the rules, then you're going to rule you out when it comes to our great technology. Exporters in other countries say, well, we can say that this would be more expensive for you. So the most effective defense policy is it would strengthen our market. And this is when we talk about the non-military measures or economic sanctions, we can achieve something there. And a final point, these economic sanctions that we've observed are an indication of failure. We say the rules of the game have been broken, then you're threatened. So we would have preferred the Russians to have understood this, and that sanctions are so tough that they simply would not have invaded Ukraine. That's what we wanted to achieve. But here we need a strong domestic market or single market. Very quickly, and you can then prepare for your questions, you and the audience. I just want to say one thing very briefly. What we just heard, and this fits in very nice. Strengthen the EU. That is trade, and that's not war. It's something else. If the European Union would say, we want to go onto another playing field, then you would be leaving an area where you've been very successful. I just wanted to make that point. Go ahead. I can just underline that, and I'd like to add one more point. What we see is that with climate change, regions undergoing climate change, in particular the global south, but maybe it's not all that precise, but still, we still can say that they are suffering more than others. although the Western countries, including the EU, emitted much more CO2 in the past, so we are more responsible for climate change. That is why it's very important for the European Union and every member state in the EU to be active in climate protection and also to abide by the international laws, even if, as we heard before, this we have a dilemma where saving emissions here is something that really is not going to stop climate change. But we still have to be credible here. We have to be authentic. Otherwise, we will not be able to work appropriately with the countries in the global south. We cannot cooperate them. This is important for both of them. Otherwise, we cannot discuss these points with them. So now you have the possibility to ask questions. Please remember to tell us who you are when you take the floor. In the back, there's somebody with a question. Lucas Neumann. For Mr. Felbermeier, for the 40% you mentioned, the successful sanctions, I'd like to know how, after a longer period of time, you can measure this and the causality between success of these sanctions. Well, that it's not an easy exercise. We look at what the professional documents say. At some point, a sanction episode is terminated, and then it comes to an end at some point in time by the government, and then it says we have achieved our goals. Then we say it was a success. Now, if that's really the case, even if 20 years may have passed, that's another question. There's been research on this. And targets are defined typically. There's a change in government perhaps, and then maybe sanctions are lifted. We say that's successful, although the change in the regime really didn't happen. So you're absolutely right there. It's difficult. Are there any other questions? Go ahead. Sophia Carr, thank you for the wonderful discussion. At the very beginning, you talked about neutrality. I'd like to ask you, how can countries afford to be neutral? And to what extent is it advisable, considering the fact that our crises are global crises and everybody is impacted by them? Thank you. Ms. Langenfeld, Claudia? Well, that's a bit embarrassing because Austria is a neutral country, like Switzerland, another neutral European country. Sweden gave up their neutrality due to the threat from Russia. We talked about the fact that there should be a European defense union at some point in time, not immediately. And if you ask yourself, how will Europe be positioned then? Well, in Austria, I would say we would have a defendable Europe, and we would try to consider the major conflicts worldwide. We want to be militarily speaking neutral, but this is a model that we can discuss. Well, I think that with many catastrophes here, it's very difficult to be neutral. Whatever happens is of no concern to me. We're much too globalized. But in terms of military areas, maybe we will see that we can come up with some acceptance. So something that cannot be imagined. And then in Germany, this is something we can't imagine either, and certainly not in France, to have majority decisions in Europe leading to the fact that soldiers would be sent somewhere to Mali, or the French do that, but with a majority maybe led by the French. And this is something that appears very difficult for me. Neutrality in the sense of defense. Go ahead. I'm sorry, there's no microphone. Oh, there you go. On Ukraine and the costs, does your institute has done some research on that? Has Germany made a sufficient contribution with respect to its economic power? Well, A.J.P. Taylor, a historian from the UK, talked about 1848 and that German history had reached a turning point, but that we missed the turning point. And with the Zeitenwende, the new area, I have the same impression. We said that we have arrived in a new world, but up until now, we haven't really taken the necessary steps in order to make this become reality. The figures are very clear. GDP in Europe is 7 times as large as Russia, industrial production 6 times this growth. And what is specific to Germany and the support that Germany has given to Ukraine is a very, very small share of our GDP, 0.2, 0.3%. This is not a large figure. And these figures, we talk about the ideal or the change in area, the new area when it comes to defense is something that's really difficult to see. We have to realize that all of the other effects in supporting Ukraine and make sure that they don't lose this war and even win this war, I think it would cost much, much more. And these costs would have to be borne to a much greater extent. I think we need to do some rethinking, and we are doing some rethinking, but we're far from being in this new reality now in order to do what is necessary. So listening to you, if I can say so, I think when it comes to climate and war, I think we have to arrive in the new world very quickly. And now is when we have to spend money. It might hurt. Oh, we think it's a lot of money, but this would prevent us to prevent even more money in the future. Am I correct? Well, we're talking here about the debt limits or a balanced budget. All of these things that we've discussed. It doesn't make things any easier. But in these existential discussions on stability and freedom in Europe, we want to shape a world, and we need to think about the fact that is an end in itself in order to have peace and security and prosperity. It's not an end in itself. It's a means to an end, and this is part of the sustainability that we need. Well, I think one point is very important here. We will have to set priorities. We have to prioritize our resources. And this is something that will be necessary even if we were to do away with the regulations on balanced budgets. We'll have to see how others go about this. You can relax this debt cap or not, but we need to consider those who produce weapons and maybe not so many wonderful cars. Cars are important for prosperity. Of course, weapons are not for individuals. So we have to talk about technology and the potential effects that might result. So there are many examples that we can talk about: optimism with regard to technology, with regard to climate. So in the short term, of course, you can go shopping, but in the medium term, we have to use real resources for this. Could I say one more thing, please? One thing I'd like to stress as a constitutional lawyer, to me it's very important. We are defending Ukraine, and Ukraine is defending our freedom. This is my personal opinion. They are defending our way of life and our democratic principles. So that is why I believe that we should think even more about what we can do. And we have to be aware of the fact, and politicians need to communicate this sufficiently. And I think this is something that has not yet happened sufficiently. It's a question of the political will and not economics. Okay, lots of questions. I'm not allowed to take any more questions. Just one more question. Lotte Villa, I can understand all of your ideas, but I would like to add something to the discussion. It's something that we all have on our minds. We have the possibility of an atomic or a nuclear attack from Russia. I'm not a military expert, but from what I know, and you confirmed this, you confirmed how much the expenditures are in Europe. In terms of military strength, with NATO, Europe is at least equivalent to the Russian military situation. So, what about escalation? And what kind of a model do we have to end this war? Because, as I said, we have plenty of scenarios that you could imagine. Where is the red line? How far will Putin and their regime go? What is the solution apart from the fact that we invest? I can understand all of this. Where is the solution? What kind of a solution can you offer us? Go ahead. An important point here is that we talk about the multipolar world system, and we don't have Cold War 2.0 with the Russians on one side and the Americans on the other. That's not what we're concerned with here. We're talking here about China, Taiwan, what's going to happen there? What about Ukraine and what the Russians have done with Ukraine? The United States, we don't know what's going to happen as of November. It's about the European Union. We've talked about that. It's a question of Russia. And then there are a number of other players involved as well. They may be interested in being neutral because they can win as a result. Well, I think that it's very difficult to measure the risk of a nuclear attack. Vladimir Putin, how much influence does he have? Will he be able to decide on this if he wants to? I don't know anybody who can assess that. So I don't know any realistic scenario for the end of the war. But most forecasts say that it will remain a flashpoint. And that's about all I can say. But I think we need to realize is that the global situation is more difficult and complex, and there aren't going to be any easy answer. So the question of defending our values is not easy. We're question of in what direction are we going to defend them if we see all of the directions we can go in. As an economist, I'd like to say that the question for us is maybe a bit clearer to say this would be an incentive to go to real negotiations in order to end the war. So I think that's basically what we need to say very clearly. And to get that far, and I think we all want peace, and this would mean much stronger and clearer support. We really need to commit to supporting Ukraine. And there should be no doubt that we will not pull out. I think the economists also have a difficult job. Well, thank you all very much.